This is Colliderscope, and I'm Caitlin Shore. Today I'm here with Dr. Rose Perry, a neuroscientist who ultimately left academia to start a nonprofit focused on community. The nonprofit, called Social Creatures, focuses on what scientists refer to as social health. And we're going to get into all that later in the conversation, but I wanted to start by talking to Dr. Perry about her experience of community when she was training as a scientist. Dr. Perry, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Perry, I'd love for you to just tell me a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a neuroscientist and physiologist by training. My work is really focused on social neuroscience specifically, so how social relationships and social contexts get under the skin, so to speak, to influence how our brain and our bodies function and develop over time. And I also am an applied researcher.
So I want to hear a little bit about what it was like during your academic training, your experience of community or lack thereof.
Yeah, so I feel like my experience when it comes to community and science, it really built over time. So I'd say in the beginning, I didn't necessarily feel a whole lot of community. I mean, I did within the lab, but it didn't feel broad. A lot of times researchers weren't talking to each other. We were studying kind of similar things, but not talking across the aisle. And I started to be a little bit more intentional about how can I begin to build some bridges between people who are working on similar issues, but maybe using different tools or working in different parts of a university.
Why do you think you felt the need to build bridges? Why was that important to you at the time?
I think what I was experiencing before I realized or came to that realization was just general frustration over people kind of organizing in their workspaces around their specialty and less around coming together around a common goal. And I kind of stumbled upon it in undergrad. Like, I feel very lucky that I was curious enough to, or I don't know, maybe too focused on high achievement in undergrad, not for the better, but it made me join multiple labs at a time. And if I hadn't have done that, I think I probably would have stayed in one lane much longer. And it would have maybe taken me longer to realize what I was the most happy doing as a scientist.
Yeah, and I also feel like it can potentially take time to build the confidence to say that there is something wrong here that maybe should change, as opposed to like when I was an undergrad, I would just assume this is how it's done. Who am I to suggest otherwise?
Yeah, and even to an extent in grad school. So in grad school, I was able to join a center that was not a physical center as much as one that scientists created of people who studied early life stress and neural development, and we would come together for meetings twice a year, and we would talk about the problem space. We would just be able to share ideas. It helped me realize that we need more of that, and then that led me into my postdoc fellowship experience eventually, where rather than seeing it as, oh man, this is a huge barrier, we got excited about NYU. I was working at New York University. We have a lot of researchers. Could we start to build some bridges between the different schools within NYU, within the different departments? And we were able to do that. So my postdoctoral work focused on bridging 3 major labs at NYU, all working in different schools. I leveraged my connections with other translationally minded researchers. So I found my tribe, so to speak, in terms of people who valued translation and direct impact. I think starting there was really important because we were working in a system that doesn't incentivize and isn't built necessarily for this. The researchers coming together were in very different parts of the city even. Like, even though they're at NYU, one of them works in Rockland, New York, an hour outside of the city, and the others were at different NYU campuses in Manhattan. So it took effort. And this is an example, I think, of how you can organize around people who just have a common goal, trying to solve the same problem and trying to inform policy in similar ways. That, yeah, I was able to have more fun with it and have a little bit more freedom to test how we could build community and collaboration in a way that maybe the traditional academic system isn't set up to do by default.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's kind of this tension in that there's some benefits to being a little bit insular inside your lab and creating this like community within the lab where you feel it's almost like a little family, a little unit, a sense of camaraderie. But then the more close you are, the more you start speaking your own specific language, you kind of have blinders on to everything else around you. So I'm wondering what tactics did you use to sort of make that work in practice? Like make the ideas translate when maybe you weren't different labs weren't speaking the same language?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wouldn't say that at the beginning that we went in with a strategy or with specific tactics, because it was such a novel thing. We were just like, hey, let's get us all around the same table for the first time. And we had, I was trying to remember the frequency of the meetings because it's been a few years, but at least for part of the time, it was weekly meetings of these big principal investigators working in a similar topic or problem space coming together literally around a table. And we quickly realized that we weren't speaking the same language. I know it sounds so simple, but people use different words for the same things all the time in science, and they're not aware of it. And also just, I think the perspective that people came in with and the differences, diversity of perspective was really transformative. Like we had to understand the viewpoint that they were bringing and why, because the incentive structures aren't always the same, and even in different areas of science, of why you're doing what you're doing. So just understanding, like, and also the researchers that we were working with, they had more proximity to communities. They have relationships with people experiencing some of the troublesome things we were studying, like we were looking at poverty and things, and they were much more sensitive than we were around how to talk about that in a publication, right? Like they were thinking about, what if one of my research subjects read this paper?
Right.
What would they think? Is it accurately reflecting their experiences? And are we, obviously the data is important, but how you're interpreting the data and writing about it is also important.
But I also feel like the thing of that it makes your brain happy is non-trivial, because I think sometimes part of this is stereotype, but I think part of it is true that science does tend to attract people that enjoy somewhat myopic thinking. You get people who are very happy to study one subtype of beetle for their entire life, and like that's the thing, and they don't need to see how it connects to humans to be happy. So I'm wondering how you think about that. Like, does everybody have to find their energy that way, or is it just that you sort of need one interloper in the lab that can bring in the outside perspectives?
I don't think everyone has to think as translationally as I like to think. I do sometimes wonder, not on the individual, like scientific level in terms of the scientist, but on the system level, when we're funding the more myopic thinking research, studying beetles. I totally understand that can lead to discoveries that then have impact. But sometimes I think the path can be meandering, or sometimes I think once that discovery is made, there's not a system pipeline of what to do with that information.
The beetle community is going to come for you, right?
I love you, beetle community, and I think your work is really important, and I want your work to be put to use. And I worry, and it doesn't need to be on you, right? I worry about the system being set up to make sure that important work is put to use and put into application. That's where my gripes come into play.
So how does that work? Like, you've talked about, organizing physical communities so that there's more interaction. What are other intentional efforts and systematic changes that can take place?
Yeah, I mean, it really needs to come from the systems level, right? So it's even just thinking about what are the values of a collaboration. Like when you form a collaboration or when you're forming the way an institute is going to function, what are the core values that you're organizing around? Is one of those translation in some way? Because if it is, you will just naturally start to structure things differently in your operations, the built environment, just how you go about doing things, the processes in the built environment. If that's not, things tend to get siloed.
So how does that become incentivized? Is it just like grants?
The incentive structure needs to change, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm optimistic about all of this.
Yeah.
Because I see incidences of the incentive structure changing. The funding bodies have a lot of power, obviously, in that regard. I'm pretty sure it's the NSF that asks you to write about broader impact in applications, and they've been doing that for a while now. I think that's really great, and not judging researchers just off of journal-based accomplishments, but off of translation-based accomplishments. And then you can build up these communities of researchers that are focused on that aspect of the problem. So it doesn't have to be the beetle community. They don't have to do it all.
Yeah.
But they need to have people they can work with that can carry that baton.
I feel like what's hard is, how do you sort of systematize that kind of exposure to other fields, right? So you were highly motivated based on just who you are and what you're interested in, and by the time you're doing your postdoc, have a focused interest in bridge building effectively.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a way to sort of, I don't know, embed that in the process more firmly?
I am optimistic that we can. That's part of why I started Social Creatures, though, is to, we can talk about what Social Creatures does, but I'll tell you behind the scenes, the goal is to reinvent that system a little bit, is how can you do research in a way that is more intentionally translational and thinking about the end game from the beginning and kind of flipping the model on the head a little bit. And I think the built environment is a big part of it. I think universities thinking about how can they put people in close proximity that are aligned across a common goal, even if they're working in completely different spaces, makes way more sense than grouping people by like neuroscience department, physiology department, like grouping it by a problem space or a topic.
Yeah.
Just because we know success stories of collaboration from chance encounters, water cooler talk, like just even there's a study from MIT, I think, on donuts. Like when you have donuts at a meeting space, people are more likely to come together and that leads to more interaction.
Yeah.
So building the built environment with that in mind, I think is key. And then we also have the advantage of Zoom and things now too.
So that's actually a great transition to Social Creatures. Can you tell me a little bit about what it is and how it got started?
Yeah, so Social Creatures is really the culmination of my frustration of working in academia, and I say that with pure joy as well.
Listen, I get it.
Yeah. So we're a social innovation and research firm. We're a nonprofit, and we focus on social neuroscience and applying that to real world settings while also equally learning from communities at the same time. So in general, we build programs to address social connection, to address social isolation and loneliness, and we also are looking to change the system, more broadly speaking, of how to embed social health into everyday health and wellness practices on a systems level. And that includes like when you go to a health checkup, are your doctors asking you, like, are they screening for loneliness or social isolation? Or are they asking beyond physical health and mental health how you're doing socially? Because the research shows that is really important. Our relationships, not only intimate, friendship, but collectively, like community level, get under the skin, so to speak, to influence our health and physiology and even our lifespan. So people with weaker social relationships are more likely to die prematurely than with stronger social relationships. So it matters for a lot of reasons. So that's like the subject matter that we focus on. But like I said, we are using it all as a testing ground as well, of maybe a different way to do research where we're bringing people together that have a common interest in that topic and in addressing social isolation and loneliness. And that's not just social neuroscientists, right? It's psychologists, population health experts, people with lived experience, policymakers, increasingly working with health insurers to help them understand that, I mean, they know the cost of it, literally.
Okay. So to me, those are all very like big ideas. So what is that? I'm sure since this is a startup, every day is pretty different, but what does that actually look like in practice? Like, what are the things that you and your team work on?
Yeah. So right now, I'd say 75% of our time is on building and testing social connection programs that we're designing in-house through our scientific expertise and through the community. So we go through a whole process with that that starts with problem identification. So that's where we start to kind of noodle on what is the problem we're trying to solve here. Is it loneliness? Is it social isolation? We talk to communities with lived experience to really get our heads wrapped around the problem and making sure that it is a problem that's real and a high priority. And if it is, then we move on to solution identification. So what can we do about the problem? What does the research say we could do that is effective? And what do communities have to say about what they think might work? And then from there, we start to build a solution and we begin to just iterate and test. Does that program actually move the needle on people's social connection and reduce loneliness, reduce social isolation? And then when we're not doing that, like building different programs and testing it, we're really focused on science communication in general, focused on building awareness around how social health is a third dimension of health alongside physical and mental health that's often overlooked.
So I'm curious, I want to dig in on this concept of social health. And I feel like one of the reasons you're such an ideal guest for this is because like you kind of study community and the benefits of community as like a scientific metric and a physiological input. So I'm curious how that is measured. What does the science tell us are the benefits of having a strong community? And like how do you measure it?
Yeah. So the benefits are widespread. There's lots of studies on lifespan, like longevity. There's studies on cardiovascular health. So being lonely or socially isolated is associated with like a 29% increased risk of cardiovascular disease and 32% increased risk of stroke. Let's see, there's mental health benefits for sure. I think the longest running longitudinal study out of Harvard showed that like the number one predictor of the lifespan is the strength of relationships in the community and the quality of relationships, which I think is really powerful. Like of all the things that can make you happy, like career, money, fame, food makes me happy, right? But community was the strongest predictor. And with social creatures, we talk about loneliness and social isolation, but I try to not say like we are a loneliness, like an organization that's only focused on that. We try to highlight the social connection piece just as much because there is such a big body of literature that studies the positives of social connection, not just the deficits that come when you don't have it. And that can be even things like, this isn't happiness, but pain reduction, right? There's like really cool studies on if you're like holding a hand or looking at the face of a loved one during a painful stimulus that you don't feel it as much and the pain centers in your brain don't light up as much. There's really cool research on how it buffers stress on a physiological level in a very powerful way, relationship quality. So there's just tons of benefits, and also just resilience research as well of like, if you look at how kids that have experienced pretty awful like natural disasters fare, the strength of relationships are like the highest predictor of resilience in those situations. So it imparts so much, and you don't have to be in a deficit mode to benefit from the power of social connection. So yeah, health is a big one for sure, but then also just quality of life, life satisfaction, productivity. There's some really interesting studies on having solid social relationships in the workplace can lead to job satisfaction, increased productivity, and I think efficiency as well. There's been some studies on that.
So how does
pretty
this
wide
relate
span.
back to like your experience in the lab? Because like I feel like you experience those feelings of isolation.
Yeah.
Like there's a theme here? Do you feel like I feel like there are certain labs that are highly collaborative, and there are ways in which a lab or a life on the bench actually is a pretty social work experience, like kind of in contrast to the image that we have of like somebody like
just
toiling
alone.
away alone. And so I'm kind of curious, do you think that, I guess it's hard to speak in broad strokes, but at least in your field, that lab work is pretty social? Or
in my experience, it was pretty social. I definitely consider some of my best friends folks that I met in academia working in the lab. I would say that at the same time, I often would go to lab, have the best time in the lab, but still feel kind of like I was in a cage, if that makes sense, because I felt more isolated from things outside of that immediate environment. And that's what affected me. That's what made me feel a little bit frustrated. And I probably stayed as long as I did because of the quality of the relationships that were within the walls of the academy. But I often felt that there was a culture of it was a little frowned upon if you had a lot of friends outside of science or if you were doing things outside of science. And I felt that I had to be really intentional to keep those friendships and to kind of counter some of those cultural aspects of being there. Yeah,
I mean, I've definitely experienced that. And I feel like something that I think is interesting, you said part of what you do at Social Creatures is science communication, right? And I do think there's this phenomenon where the more confined you are to your lab or to your space in academia, the less able you are to talk to the wider public. I know, like, when I was working on my dissertation, I would go into my hole and like write for a week, or I'd be talking to people in my program, and then I'd go to some normal person party and they'd be like, "What are you working on?" And I'd be like, "Oh no, I don't know how to talk
you
to
get like afraid to even be asked because
but then it was good because then when I was trying to write just like the abstract of my whole dissertation, I like went back to that party and tried to be like, how did I put it in a nutshell? So Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Do you feel like it took a while to build up your science communication skills?
Oh, I had to practice that. It was a muscle to be built. And I felt very similar to you. Like there were situations where I was like, I don't know how to describe to my family what I'm doing. Like they're asking lovely questions or what are you doing? What's your work on? And I can't describe it in a way. In my very end of grad school and in postdoc, I found a nonprofit in the city called, it's kind of funny name, No Science, but KNOW. It translates better writing than saying it out loud. And it was a science communication nonprofit. Like the whole purpose was to set up these really fun events throughout the city where scientists would just communicate what they were doing to a lay audience. And they put us through science communication training, and that ended up being a really good venue for me to build that muscle. Because, did you feel like you often, like if you tried to write in the academic setting accessibly, that you would get pushback?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the social sciences where I feel like it's a little bit more accepted because there's almost an expectation there that you're going to write a book at some point, or that like it may be still a little bit wonky, but you have to have a little bit more writing ability in those departments. But I know but at the same time, if I was too fun in my writing, which like I like to do because being fun is fun, that of course would be in some instances frowned upon. But I had an advisor that I think appreciated a little humor and stuff. But I do know in like science proper, there is the so-called Sagan effect, right? That the more you communicate outside of the sciences, the more it is perceived that you're not being productive within your actual
or is
field.
Intelligent or So that I think is an interesting cultural thing that happens in some corners of academia that we kind of push against in social creatures as well. And just thinking about when you're writing as an academic who your audience is. Yes, it's other scientists, but shouldn't it also be the broader public?
Yeah, and even the idea that like, yes, other scientists, but almost no other scientists understand what you're working on.
True.
So like,
it's true.
Even the lab next door to you, they'll share some overlap, but they won't know some other corner of the research. And so if you, not just in sort of like a science communication to the public and trying to get more broader community involvement, but even trying to do the work that you're doing, meaning like, or that you were doing, like trying to get different labs to talk to each other, it should be accessible, or else you're not going to be able to find those connections.
Yeah, and that's always the number one piece of advice I give if someone asks. You have to learn the language.
Yeah.
Because it's not always enough to have people in a lab right next to each other because you're speaking a different language. So the road always leads me back to the system needs to change a little bit or adjust a little bit if the system is going to value collaboration. And I think it should, because I'm of the opinion that collaboration leads to faster impact and better impact.
Yeah. So let's talk about that like outermost circle of getting to the communities that are impacted by work. I want to just hear a little bit more about, you said that you got like the community feedback on ideas and sort of how that works.
So we involve the community from the very beginning. So in the problem identification phase, that's normally interviews and focus groups. And I can give you an example of that with one of our programs at Social Creatures, which is called Sit Grit Fitness, which I would have laughed if you were like, hey, Rose, guess what? You're starting this social connection nonprofit, and now you're running a fitness program. Yeah. Like, I just did not see that coming.
You're not a spin instructor?
No.
Oh, no, okay.
But yeah, so we set out in the early days of Social Creatures. We were looking at the literature and seeing the prevalence of loneliness in the disability community. I myself have dwarfism, so I also have lived experience with that. Is like 4x higher than non-disabled individuals. So we wanted to see if we could do something about that or explore maybe doing something about that. And we set up focus groups. We met with individuals who are wheelchair users, and we were asking questions about loneliness and isolation and social exclusion. And they validated that is a problem, right? But they very quickly were like, well, you know why it's a problem is because of upstream factors. Like, right now, we're wheelchair users in New York City, and there's a pandemic raging outside, and we're afraid to go out for good reason. Yeah. And we get most of our exercise from rolling our chairs around outside because we're in little apartments. Yep. And now my able-bodied roommate is has Equinox classes or just like fancy fitness classes streamed right into the apartment, and it's in my face more than ever that this world wasn't built for me to participate in. And that's the crux a lot of times with social connection issues, is that the system is not necessarily equitable for everyone to be able to fully participate in society. So we use that example as we want to still very much move the needle on social connection for this community, but they were telling us to do that in a way that they would engage. We needed to go upstream and work on the social infrastructure inequities that exist. So we built Secret. We have like Olympic level trainers, like coaches that normally train Olympic athletes, training our clients, and we do group fitness classes twice a week now. It's a whole community. And within less than a year, our Secret participants showed 65% increased social connection. So, I don't think that they are thinking about it so much, but it's definitely like they're coming for the community. They have told us that.
Yeah.
But they're also coming for the exercise.
Yeah.
And we're seeing improvements in terms of social connection.
Yeah, it's like so many things. I mean, even with work, right? It's like, yeah, you do your work and maybe you think intellectually I'm going because I'm excited to solve this problem or work on this cause, but like,
what's actually going to
are the people
excited?
cool?
Yeah, exactly.
At the end of the day, are the people cool?
Yeah, do I enjoy my day to day? And that's so important. Like, I think that's huge.
So at Social Creatures, are the people cool?
I think they're cool.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been very curated to be cool people.
Cool people who are cool to you?
Yeah. No, just in general. I mean, because it's not, yes, some of them are like colleagues that came from academia with me, but a lot of people are people that I just probably never would have the opportunity to meet if I would have stayed in academia, because we're being very intentional about not building communities that are based on geographical proximities or cognitive proximities or social proximities. So I now have friends from all different walks of life, and my social circle is much more diverse because of that.
Yeah. So how do you think that kind of intentional team building can translate to other organizations?
Yeah, I think the intentionality is key. I don't know, I would be curious to hear what you think on how collaboration tends to unfold, but I think a lot of times it's things like chance encounters or friendships, because we like working with people that bring us joy, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but if you don't step back and also add this layer of intentionality, that's when you risk your communities being bound by some sort of proximity. Whether that's like because you have the same training, or you are in the same institute, or you're in the same
I think it's
neighborhood.
hard because on the one hand, we're saying like, yes, be intentional about it and try to like make sure that there isn't like a group think and all that. But then also, yes, chance encounters, and you can't plan chance encounters because they're supposed to be chance.
But you can plan the environment.
You can plan the environment
for chance encounters and make sure that everyone has access to that environment for the chances. That's how I think about it.
Sure. I'm just curious, either in the research or from your own experience, how you think about your work relationships as in terms of their mental benefits, like how the people at work help you challenge your thinking and help you like lead you to better discoveries, better work, and both just the psychological benefits.
Yeah, and I feel like personally I've really felt that quality of life piece and motivation piece. Like it was very motivating for me to go into the lab every day and work with people that I like and get along with, and we just have fun, not just doing the work, but we're having fun while we're doing it. So I think that's really important. I think about this all the time now that I'm more of in a leadership position of making sure that we're hopefully having healthy social connection among all of us. But I think it's important to also balance conversations of relationships and work with relationships outside of work, because we spend so much time in work. And I just think also valuing your employees outside of work relationships and structuring the work environment for that is important. So that sometimes suffered for me in academia, right? Like sometimes I put so much into the work, and it was fun, right? Because I loved who I was working with, but that meant relationships with other friends and family suffered. So I think it's important to strike a balance, and recognizing that your employees' social circles extend beyond the working relationships, I think is really important if you really want your employees to have good social health. It can't just come from the work relationships.
What I love about what you're doing is that sort of bringing some of these abstract concepts like community into something that we can measure and like see the benefits of. So I feel like if we're putting social health on the same level as physical and mental health, we can also think about it in terms of like, how can I improve this aspect of my health? And I guess my question is like, what's good? Like how much do I have to socialize? Obviously it varies person to person, but like, what's like a good amount of community connection? How many people do I have to talk to in a week to reap the benefits?
No, this is a common question, and I don't like giving guidelines on an individual level, but this is easy because unlike some things, you can kind of feel what's good for you. So everyone has a natural set point for their need for social connection, and that is really variable. Like introverts have a much lower, like they don't need as much social connection as extroverts do. So I think it's more about just getting attuned with how you feel.
So up to this point, what has brought you the most joy in your career?
I mean, I think the people have, but also just the evolution of who those people are in my circle, in my career. So just like increasingly adding layers of people with different perspectives and different expertise has brought me the most joy, because it's also allowed me, like, it's not just them that brings me joy, but it's been challenging in a fun way, in a way that I like to kind of step into a new space and try to get my bearings and learn how to talk to someone and forge those connections, because I feel like that's where the transformation occurs. So that brings me joy in moments like that.
Imagine that you're you looking back on your career years in the future. What do you think you'd be most proud that you'd accomplished?
Honestly, I think I would be most proud that I didn't give in to pressure to achieve, and that I think I shifted throughout my career of being more achievement focused or less achievement focused and more focused on being happy and feeling right in what I was doing. So I think I felt a lot of uncertainty for a while because I couldn't say like, I want to be this, or this is what I want my job to look like in 5 years. Like I didn't really have that end game as a vision in my mind, and that caused me some level of stress just because of the uncertainty. So I'm just glad that I found something that makes me happy and that leverages the skills that I spent time learning how to do at the same time.
I feel like hearing about your whole career and how it's evolved, there's a very strong theme of intentional community building. And I have this visual in my mind that's these like concentric circles that keep going out further, like expanding beyond the lab to different departments. And then, out into the real human community, to the people that are benefiting from research. And I really appreciate seeing you traverse those circles throughout your career, which I know in many cases is not easy, especially like when you're saying it takes a little bit of confidence to say, I want to do things a little bit differently, and to take the step to leave academia, even though you love it, but doing science in your own way. And I'm wondering just, do you have any closing thoughts on the role of community in your career and the joy that it's brought you?
Yeah, well, thank you for putting it that way, because it does feel like I've been kind of through the concentric circles, and it's been a fun journey. I just hope that people know that they don't need to live by the boundaries of communities as they are set up in the current system, that you can build intentional communities. And when you start to get into those concentric circles, scientific discovery, I think it looks different sometimes in those circles. You can have these aha moments that aren't based on doing more research. They're just based on speaking to people with diverse perspectives. I've definitely experienced that in my career, and those are the sorts of moments that have brought me the most joy.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Perry.
Thank you for having me. Great to meet you too.
Thanks for listening to Colliderscope. Science happens because of community, and progress happens together. To learn more about how you can progress with AbCam, visit abcam.com.